Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusions. Jehovah's Witnesses are unique in their refusal of blood transfusions, specifically when such refusal will result in death. Does the Bible really teach that blood transfusions are wrong? Death from refusing blood. It is a tragedy that each year Jehovah's Witnesses die as a result of refusing blood transfusions. Even more tragic is when youths die due to the beliefs of their parents. Watchtower articles admit that this belief results in the death of their children and goes so far as to celebrate this sacrifice. For instance, in the Awake 1994, May 22, it said, "In former times, thousands of youths died for putting God first. They are still doing it. Only today the drama is played out in hospitals and courtrooms with blood transfusions the issue." This article actually has a picture of Jehovah's Witness children that have died refusing blood. These youths have been coerced into believing if they allowed doctors to perform a blood transfusion, they could be forfeiting their everlasting life. For instance, What Does the Bible Really Teach in 2005 said, "Suppose doctors say that he must have a blood transfusion or he will die. If we tried to save our present life by breaking God's law, we would be in danger of losing everlasting life." An example is Joshua Walker, to which an article was presented in the Awake of 1995 called Joshua's Faith. In 2016, Anthony Morris at the Remain Loyal to Jehovah convention talked about this situation and discussed that they were proud of how Joshua had stood up for his right to refuse a blood transfusion.
Amazing young fella. And when he's resurrected, you'll hear more from him because Jehovah loves that little fella.
How terrible that the pointless death of Joshua was put forward as an example for other children, and to hear a crowd of people clapping afterwards. Is it really a Bible teaching? In Bible times, it was important to show respect for life, which required the bleeding of an animal to show respect for the life taken. While blood is used as a symbol of life, the Bible shows that respect for life itself is even more important. For example, Jesus taught that saving a life was more important than strict adherence to the law. In Matthew 12 verse 11 he says, "Who will be the man among you that has one sheep, and if this falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not get hold of it and lift it out? All considered, how much more worth is a man than a sheep?" Even the strictest Orthodox Jews who soak meat in water and salt to draw out all the blood will accept the blood transfusion. In the Mosaic law, sustaining life overruled any rule, a principle referred to as pikuach nefesh. Furthermore, biblical commands on blood, such as given to Noah at Genesis 9 verse 4, said that the blood was to be poured out of a slaughtered animal. Blood transfusions do not result in the death of the donor. Something is disturbingly wrong when a religion teaches that sanctity for the symbol of life, in this case blood, is more important than life itself. Watchtower's changing belief. Once you become aware that Watchtower has frequently changed its teachings on blood, you will appreciate that this teaching has not been directed by God. Prior to 1945, it was allowable for Jehovah's Witnesses to eat blood and have blood transfusions. Commencing in July 1951, Watchtower specifically condemned blood transfusions. Whole blood and any type of blood fraction was forbidden. The Watchtower 1961 said, "Whether whole or fractional, one's own or someone else's, transfused or injected, it is wrong." In 1974, blood serum became a conscience matter. In 1983, hemodilution became acceptable. In 1995, blood salvage procedures became acceptable. Significant additional change occurred in 2000 when all blood fractions became acceptable. Watchtower 2000 said, "When it comes to fractions of any of the primary components, each Christian, after careful and prayerful meditation, must conscientiously decide for himself." So we see that this new rule released in 2000 was a big change from that 1961 quote that blood fractions were wrong. Between 1951 and 2000, how many Jehovah's Witnesses needlessly died refusing critical blood components because Watchtower was promoting rules that it later admitted was wrong? The governing body has never admitted responsibility for those deaths. They've never apologised to parents who needlessly lost their children, or to the children whose parents may have died for no good reason for refusing critical blood components and fractions. There are still obvious and significant flaws with Watchtower's current teaching. If blood fractions are to be poured out onto the ground, where do blood fractions that Jehovah's Witnesses are using come from? Why are Jehovah's Witnesses forbidden from donating blood if they're allowed to use blood fractions? Who do the blood fractions that Jehovah's Witnesses are using come from? It's a totally hypocritical stance that they have. Scriptural stance on blood. Watchtower uses several scriptures to justify their stance on refusing blood transfusions. Now, these passages are poorly interpreted and do not refer to blood transfusions at all, but rather to the eating of blood, which the Watchtower claims should be considered the same. The first passage that addresses eating blood was to Noah at Genesis 9 verse 4. Now, the Watchtower incorrectly claims, such as at the Watchtower 2008, God imposed this one restriction, that we were not to consume blood, and then it refers to Genesis 9 verse 3 and 4. But this is incorrect. Genesis 9 verse 4 says only flesh with its soul, its blood, you must not eat. So it doesn't state that you must not eat blood. It states that you must not eat flesh of an animal that has not been bled, so still has its blood in it. Now, the first time it was actually stated that blood was not to be eaten is in the Mosaic law at Leviticus 17 verse 10. But this is not relevant to Christians since the Mosaic law ceased when Jesus died, which is very clear in Romans 10 verse 4, and something that the Watchtower teaches too. Jesus also said that Christians are not defiled by what they eat. Now, there is one scripture that may seem compelling for why blood transfusions are wrong today. And this is from Acts 15:21, and this is the scripture that Watchtower mostly refers to. There it says that as for the believers among the nations we have sent out, rendering our decision that they should keep themselves from what is sacrificed to idols, as well as from blood and what is strangled, and from fornication. It says 4 things that they were told that they must abstain from that were part of the Mosaic law. In isolation, Acts 15:21 may appear to indicate that Christians were not to consume blood. If that's so obvious, why didn't Jehovah's Witnesses originally interpret it this way, and why do other Christian religions think that the use of blood is acceptable? Now, the situation at Acts specifically addressed congregations where the Jewish Christians were having difficulty accepting the Gentile Christians, claiming that they were superior by following the Mosaic law. The older men concluded that the observation of the Mosaic law was unnecessary, but that they recommended observing these 4 requirements that were read out at the synagogue on the Sabbath, from Leviticus 17 to 18. Paul later showed that Acts 15:21 was not binding on Christians when in 1 Corinthians he said that the eating of food sacrificed to idols is fine, provided it does not stumble anyone. And so the requirement not to consume blood, as shown in that scripture, or even eat food sacrificed to idols, is irrelevant to us today. Now further, of course, none of these scriptures discuss blood transfusions. They just talk about eating blood. Now, Watchtower erroneously says it logically applies to transfusions, but that is not the case. A person that donates blood does not die, which was the underlying concept in these passages that refer to taking the life of a slaughtered animal. Also, eating blood does not save a person's life, but a blood transfusion does. So again, there's a lot more importance in accepting a blood transfusion. Rights of children. Parents have a duty of care toward their children, and governmental authorities are expected to remove a child from a parent that is endangering them. When a Jehovah's Witness parent refuses blood for a child in a life or death situation, it is common for the courts to rule against the parents and administer a transfusion, and rightfully so. Unfortunately, children raised and indoctrinated to view blood as wrong can refuse a blood transfusion upon reaching 18. It is not possible to ask the children that were sacrificed for their religion how they feel about having died as martyrs. It is, however, possible to find out how children that survived the court-ordered blood transfusion feel. Such is the case of Carolyn Ivy, born prematurely to Jehovah's Witness parents in 1975, weighing just 2 pounds. Doctors determined that a blood transfusion was required to save her, and a young attorney named Joel Cohen worked tirelessly to ensure that she received the required treatment. 3 decades later, Cohen received an email with the line, "You saved my life when I was a baby." It raised the hair on my neck, he says. Carolyn relates, "I contacted Mr. Cohen to thank him for saving my life. If it was not for Mr. Cohen fighting for me, I would not be here today. It brought me to tears that he would try so hard." It is tragic to think of all the Jehovah's Witness children that did not receive that chance and were sacrificed by their parents for their parents' misguided faith. The Bible does not forbid blood transfusions, and due to the frequent changes Watchtower has made over the years in regards to blood transfusions, it is warranted to question whether Jehovah is directing the governing body regarding this stance. Don't be a martyr. If a blood transfusion is required to ever save your life, the right thing to do is to allow a blood transfusion.